of the New Brighton Historical Society. And as you can see, we've got a pretty hot program today. And in fact, I'm going to have Sally Peters from the Ramsey County Library. She's associated with that, and they provide this venue for us. So we really appreciate that. But she wants to say a few words, and then we will get the program kicked off. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to see this big turnout for this very fascinating program. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the New Brighton Historical Society and the Minnesota Legacy Fund, which is a taxpayer-funded arrangement that brings art and culture and history into the community, which is something that the taxpayers have asked for, and we are offering it in this very special way. I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. We have Mark Haidet. He has worked for the Minnesota Historical Society for 36 years, 10 years as a historian, and 26 years in the development office. As Director of Development, he built a comprehensive program and led 3 major campaigns for the Minnesota History Center, the Mill City Museum, and the Greatest Generation Project. He closed his career with 3 years at the State Fair Foundation, where he completed the campaign to build the fair's new History and Heritage Center. Now retired, Mark is helping others as a freelance historian and fundraising consultant. And today, Mark Haidet is going to talk to us about a very important part of New Brighton history, and that was the Twin Cities Arsenal. He's going to tell us about the sacrifices that New Brighton residents made for this facility and the impact that the Arsenal had on New Brighton and the impact that New Brighton's sacrifices had on our World War II effort. And at this time, I'd like to have you help me welcome Mark Haidet.
And thank you all for coming. All I can say is wow. And you will learn from the talk that wow is also appear in my talk. But this is really unexpected. And I'm grateful on such a beautiful day that all of you came out. Now, before I start, I have been asked to just mention that a contribution basket is going to be going around circulating the room. So I'm sorry to have to begin with that. Okay. Well, the Twin Cities Arsenal has been our neighbor and an important part of our history since 1941. It provided employment for tens of thousands of people and produced ammunition for the U.S. use during 4 conflicts: World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. Today, the Arsenal property is the largest tract of undeveloped land in the core metropolitan area, and its development over the next decade will continue to impact our community. This afternoon, we are going to explore how the Arsenal came to be, its role during World War II, and its impact on the village of New Brighton during the war years. But I'd like to begin with just a few questions to get to see if there's any, the special people that are here. And because this is a talk about World War II, I'd like to ask, are there any World War II veterans in the crowd? A couple. Right here, let's acknowledge them. I would also like to ask if anyone was living on the Arsenal property in 1941 when it was taken over. Or if there are descendants of families that moved out of the Arsenal area. Couple back here. And did anyone work at the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant during World War II? After World War II, right here, we have one that's after World War II, though. And how many of you were living in New Brighton in the early 1940s when the Arsenal came out here? Should be a lot of hands go up here. First, I want to point out that titling the talk "The Twin Cities Arsenal During World War II" is a bit of a misnomer. In 1941, when it was built, it was the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. In 1946, the name was changed to the Twin Cities Arsenal. And in 1963, to the Twin Cities Army Ammunition Plant. Now, there are two major themes that I'd like to emphasize today. One is that the TCOP, I'll call the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant TCOP, the TCOP World War II story has been called a, quote, miracle of modern American industry, unquote. The plant was constructed in record time and established production records. TCOP and its employees played a significant contribution to Allied victory. Secondly, the plant brought tremendous change to New Brighton. It launched the process of transforming the community from what one historian has called a rural hamlet on the outskirts of two mid-sized provincial cities, unquote, into a thriving suburb of one of our nation's great metropolitan centers. Now let's first set the stage, and first looking at the community of New Brighton. This is a...
I would just say, keep trying to speak into the microphone. You turn away, we can't hear you.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is an aerial photograph of New Brighton from 1927. And you'll notice here is St. John's Church, here is the Village Hall, here is the First Congregational Church, and the pool yards are down here. In 1933, a writer from a national agricultural publication attending the community's annual squash show described the village as, quote, a well-built little town of 368 inhabitants full of good-looking people, unquote. New Brighton's population had been stable for 50 years. It fluctuated between 355 in 1890 and 658 in 1940. Now that 1940 population also includes a lot of farm families because there were over 2,000 acres that comprised the incorporated community. In November 1939, the community proudly celebrated its new school building. And the school was built with the assistance of the WPA. That building will soon be coming down. Now, I also have to put what happened here in the context of what World War II. The European conflict began in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. In May 1940, Germany looked west and invaded Belgium and France. And within 6 weeks, France collapsed, leaving Great Britain to stand alone against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union wouldn't come into the war on the Allied side until the following year. Winston Churchill was desperate for American help, and President Roosevelt wanted to help, but he had to move cautiously because most Americans wanted to avoid involvement in another European conflict. Minnesota's own Charles Lindbergh was a leader of the American First movement. Throughout the 1940s, Roosevelt began to prepare America for war. The first goal was to rearm the country and to enlist private industry in the effort. It's important to point out here that until 1940, there were only 6 arsenals in the United States producing devoted to military arms production. And only one produced small arms ammunition, the Frankfurt Arsenal outside Philadelphia. In 1939, that arsenal had been operating with antiquated equipment. In 1939, it installed new equipment, establishing an assembly line production process that would become the model for 6 what they were called GOCO plants that were built in the coming years. creating a national system of government-owned, contractor-operated GOCO defense plants. A small military staff oversaw these facilities. The guidelines were that it had to be the plants had to be located inland, away from the coast, for safety reasons, against attack, near rail transportation, ample water resources, and an abundant labor supply. The first wave of GOCO contracts were awarded in the summer of 1940. By 1944, there would be 77 GOCO plants operating in the U.S. On December 29, 1940, the residents of New Brighton and people throughout the United States gathered around their radio stations to listen to one of President Roosevelt's most famous fireside chats. He told Americans, quote, "If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the high seas. They will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. The Americas will be living at the point of a gun. We must be the great arsenal of democracy." In March 1941, Congress approved Lend-Lease, and Lend-Lease gave Roosevelt the authority to provide military equipment to Great Britain without payment. Within Lend-Lease, the demand for war materials skyrocketed. In April, the War Department announced plans to build 3 GOCO small arms ammunition plants in the Midwest. 3 were already under construction from the first wave. Minnesota's congressional delegation and business leaders lobbied for a plant to be built in the Twin Cities. On May 26, 1941, Charles Horne, the president of Federal Cartridge Company, FCC, met with War Department officials in Washington to make the case for Federal Cartridge to operate one of the new plants. In June, the War Department announced that it would be building a plant in the Twin Cities, and several sites were considered. And the New Brighton site was selected the first week of July. Now, what amazes me is how quickly everything goes forward from here. But I'll first tell you about the site. The site was 2,425 acres. This is a map, and we actually have a copy up here on the table, listing all of the property owners and the acreage that they owned. There were 45 families living on the site in small holdings, typically 40 to 80 acres in size. There were approximately 125 buildings. There was a 40-acre arboretum developed by Dr. Jonas Christensen, a University of Minnesota plant pathologist. He had over 5,000 trees, 300 varieties. Every variety from Minnesota, it was said, plus trees from around the world. He also had 25,000 plants on his property. There was an Isaac Walton League waterfowl refuge, the Mounds View Ski Club Hill, School District number 15, and 2 taverns. And here's a list of property owners, including the state and public, just everybody that had some property there. In describing the events of the next few weeks, the Ramsey County News, which was a weekly newspaper published in New Brighton, reported a couple of weeks later that the government's acquisition of the land, quote, progressed with lightning rapidity, unquote. This is a view of the Arsenal land before the government came in. In the second week of July, families were notified to vacate their properties by midnight, August 3rd. The Farm Security Administration was available to provide assistance. The land was appraised in late July, and by midnight, August 3rd, all families but one had relocated. Many found homes in the immediate area, and their descendants still live here. And if you look at the map up here, you'll recognize many of the names. The Indikowitz family, Nick, his son Paul and his wife, and their 3 children, and this is Paul and his son and their oldest 2 children, and all the children were under age 4, refused to vacate their homes, saying, quote, "We'll stay here until we find a decent place to go or until they take us out," unquote. The family operated a sand and gravel pit and had lived on the land for over 20 years. And here's a headline, the Minneapolis Star chronicled the standoff. And here it says, holding the fort on the 2nd floor. Army guards were posted around the property, and on August 11th, the Army secured a writ of assistance to forcibly remove Paul's family. The family left the following day, 1 hour before the deadline set by the judge. Now to look at the contractor. On July 14th, that is, the War Department awarded an $86 million contract to Federal Cartridge to build, equip, and operate the plant during its first year of operation. Now, I tried to figure this out, and if I did the calculations right, that would be $15.3 billion in today's money. Here are the 2 men most responsible for the success of this huge undertaking. Charles Horne, the general manager and president of FCC, and Robert Elin, who he appointed in May 1942 to be the general manager for the TCOP plant. Now some background on Federal Cartridge. It was a small manufacturer of sporting ammunition, nothing larger than .22 caliber. It was founded in Anoka in 1916. The company was failing in 1922 when Horne took it over. Horne was an effective leader and a marketing genius, and he built FCC into a successful business. In 1941, the company employed 550 people, making it one of the smallest companies to receive a GOCO contract. Horne later wrote, quote, "The Army was doubtful that a small company such as Federal Cartridge could do the job," unquote. Site preparation began in mid-August, and on August 28th, 7,000 people attended the groundbreaking ceremony. This is a view from left to right: Horne, Governor Harold Stassen, Major General Eugene Reynold, he was the chief engineer of the U.S. Army, and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph S. Underwood. And Underwood was the military officer that oversaw the small military presence that was at the site. Over the next 5 months, thousands of construction workers transformed the rural landscape into one of the region's largest industrial complexes. By early December, over 11,000 construction workers were working around the clock. They lit the area at night with spotlights. They were working 3 shifts around the clock, 6 days a week. And here's just some construction views. The bombing of Pearl Harbor increased the urgency. They changed to 7 days a week construction, and site security was increased to prevent acts of sabotage. Within days of the Pearl Harbor attack, the government authorized an expansion of the plant, doubling its capacity, and a second expansion was announced the following summer. Now, the original plant, that plant number 1, was all built to be a permanent complex of buildings, over 100 buildings. And it was built with bricks and stone, concrete. The 2 expansions were designed to be temporary buildings to last 5 to 10 years, and they were all timber construction. Plant number 1 was essentially complete by the end of January. And by early 1943, all major construction was completed. This is the headquarters building. And here's a summary from the Army Corps of Engineers report summarizing the construction work that was done on the plant. You'll see they built 323 buildings, 21 miles of water lines, 31 miles of sewer lines, and 14 miles of gas lines, 22 miles of roads, and 15.6 miles of railroads, and a number of wells so that they'd have that water that they needed. And here's what the report identified as the costs, for a total expense of $71.1 million. Now, plant number 1 was designed for 8,500 workers. I've had the privilege over the last few months of meeting a number of people, and one of them, and I was hoping that he would be here today, is Bill Horne, who is Charles Horne's son. But wasn't able to come, but I met with him, he shared some stories. He was an 11-year-old when the project started. And he told me about when the word leaked out that Federal Cartridge was going to be hiring a lot of people. Their headquarters were located in the Fauché Tower. He said those first couple of days that the lobby, the stairwells, the elevators were clogged with people wanting to pick up application forms. And then they finally got wise and set up a desk in the lobby so that people could pick up forms. The FCC sent several dozen employees from its Anoka plant to the Frankfurt Arsenal for a month of in-depth training. And then they came back and offered training to middle management people who would be overseeing the production process. The cover of the January 11th Minneapolis Sunday Tribune and Star Journal magazine declared, "We of the Twin Cities can certainly be proud of what has been accomplished here in so short a time to back up our boys on the fighting front." It also says, a few months ago, a cornfield, now the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. When the plant opened, it was a self-contained community. It had its own fire department and police force. And this is the fire department. It had its own water system. It had its own radio station, its own telephone exchange, hospital. It published its own newspaper, the Twin Cities Ordnance News, which began publication in May, and this is the very first issue. And we'll come back to that. We'll keep them shooting a little bit later on. And 4 cafeterias. This picture also shows, and Horne was committed to emphasizing diversity, and you'll hear more about that later too. But this shows women and men. It shows an African American. It shows a Filipino. It shows a mixture of people that together will keep them shooting. Production began on February 5th, 1942, 3 months ahead of schedule. The plant manufactured 4 kinds of 30 and 50 caliber cartridges: ball cartridges, armor-piercing cartridges, tracer cartridges, and incendiary. This is actually 2 of the cartridges that were manufactured at the plant. The 30 caliber is the smaller one. The 50 caliber is the larger one. Employment increased as plants 2 and 2A came online, eventually peaking at 26,000 in the summer of 1943. Imagine 2 things. A company of 550 people within about a year goes to 26,000 plus the people that are working in Anoka. And also, here's the little community of New Brighton, and 26,000 people are right outside, right our neighbor. And here's some pictures of people working on the production lines. There were 7 major manufacturing buildings and 35 production lines in the total plant. And when they were fully operating, they produced 6 railroad freight cars of ammunition every day. The workers worked in 3 shifts, 6 days a week. It was around the clock. And there was, I was asked earlier, and I can't tell too much about this, but there were some accidents at the plant and some deaths that happened. But what I do want to tell you about is one of the tragic events that happened. And it happened in November 1942. Alexander P. Nelson, who was a 67-year-old retired state employee, was out in his front yard over by Turtle Lake, and he was killed by a ricocheting bullet. Nelson Drive, between Lexington Avenue and Turtle Lake, is named in his honor. Now, many area residents worked at the plant, and reading the ordnance news and looking at the photos, I was able to identify at least 2 of them. One of them was Aloysius Schutte. He lived on the site for more than 30 years, and he was an elevator operator. And Peter Zawistowski, he is actually the forklift driver here. But this is a photo that was taken to celebrate the 4 billionth cartridge manufactured at the plant. And Elon is in the middle of the 3 people looking at the cartridges. But the forklift driver was a New Brighton resident. One of the most memorable events in the plant's history occurred on September 19, 1942. Night shift workers were surprised by a special visitor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The president was on the 3rd day of a 2-week trip, top secret trip, 8,754 miles, to visit 21 defense plants. The news of his tour could not be published until after he returned to Washington, D.C. on October 1st. The plant's full complement of 430 security officers and 100 soldiers from Fort Snelling were on hand to provide security. Governor Stassen and Horne met the president's train on the plant grounds, and they accompanied Roosevelt on a 1-hour driving tour through the plant. Near the end of the tour, Peggy Jolfs, a final visual inspection forelater living in Columbia Heights, presented the president with a gold-plated cluster of cartridges. This photo appeared on the front page of the October 2nd issue of the New York Times and in newspapers around the country. And here's a picture of the cluster that she presented to the president. The need for more brass was one of the biggest obstacles to full production at the plant in 1942. And brass was in short supply because of a serious copper shortage, a key ingredient in making brass. Horne used the president's visit to plead his case for more brass. Harold Stassen recalled in a 1999 interview that Horne told the president at least 5 or 6 times that he needed more brass. Horne later said that at one point the president turned to him and asked what he thought about steel cases. Horne told him that his team was already working on that. I should back up. I mean, Stassen, for one, the president was amazed at how many women were working at TCOP, and he commented on that. And Horne said, yes, and they're great workers. But, Mr. President, we need more brass. In early 1943, TCOP employees working in cooperation with the Frankfurt Arsenal developed a successful process to manufacture steel cases. It was a development that was hailed as, quote, an outstanding contribution in the war effort, unquote. That June, workers took an hour break from their work, and over 20,000 people attended the presentation of the first of 4 E awards presented to TCOP. And this is the award certificate that employees got, and also on top there is the badge that they could wear, and they wore those badges proudly. Now there's 2 important labor stories associated with TCOP that deserve special mention. World War II saw more women enter the workforce than any previous time in history. One of the most important stories was the role they played in America's defense industry. They were wows. Wow. When Roosevelt returned to Washington from his 1942 tour, one of the stories in the paper was how he commented on the work women were doing at TCOP, operating equipment of all kinds. By mid-1943, 60% of the workforce was women. And here, speaking of pinup girls, these were all defense industry employees. This is from, I think it's from the Tribune or the Star. And here's a couple photos of women at in the workplace there. The second story was the employment of African Americans. On June 25, 1941, Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring all defense contractors not to discriminate against any worker because of race, creed, or color. Horne was committed to hiring African Americans. In late 1941, he told a gathering of Twin Cities businessmen that TCOP would be open for all, and if whites did not want to work side by side with African Americans, they could work elsewhere. He hired Cecil Newman, the publisher and editor of the Minneapolis Spokesman, an African American newspaper in Minneapolis and a leader in the African American community, for the sole purpose of recruiting African Americans. At one time, 1,200 African Americans were working at TCOP. And this is very interesting when you consider that at the time there were only about 13,000 African Americans living in Minnesota. And it was said that this was 20% of the working age population of African Americans. The federal government recognized TCOP as the nation's, quote, model plant in its integration and treatment of Negro labor, unquote. And in 1944, Roosevelt appointed Horne to the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Now, this was assembly line process. It was boring and tedious, and people were working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. So one of the challenges for Horne, Elin, and their team was to keep a high level of morale. They employed many strategies in doing this. The main one for many people was that they were the wives. They were the wives. They had sons and they had brothers serving on the front lines. So they wanted to provide as much ammunition as possible, as quickly as possible, so we could win the war. The plant launched its Keep 'em Shooting campaign, and the motto was, "Our bullets will do it." There were posters hung throughout the plant, and the Twin Cities Ordnance News kept the message in front of workers. There you can see the 2 issues of Twin Cities Ordnance News. The one, Avenge Pearl Harbor, Our Bullets Will Do It. And then, did our bullets do it in North Africa? You bet they did. Important visitors, in addition to the president, called for more production. military leaders, and wounded servicemen. Oh, I think there's a, oh, no, I'm right. The Crown Prince Olaf of Norway and Princess Martha toured the plant in April 1942. And on March 11, 1943, Thomas and Alida Sullivan and their daughter visited for a luncheon and meetings with employees as part of a national tour that was sponsored by the Navy. The couple's 5 sons had died when the USS Juneau was sunk 4 months earlier. The company also published letters from soldiers like this one from Private Leonard Skiba, and Leonard was from New Brighton. And before doing that, this is a cartoon that appeared in the Twin Cities Ordnance News. Skiba wrote, "From somewhere in Germany to all the workers at Twin Cities Ordnance Plant, we boys over here are very proud of you. In our drive through France, Belgium, and Germany, I've noticed a lot of our ammunition comes from your plant. We know that you are doing a big share of the burden that it will take to bring this war to an end. Now that we are fighting the enemy on his soil, we must double our efforts. If there's a possibility of doing better, the boys over here would be grateful to you." Campaigns were undertaken to promote safety and to combat absenteeism in order to keep workers on the job. The cartoon here, it reads, "Honorable spies in the U.S. report some TCOP employees play new game called hooky. Stay home from work without reason. So sorry for American war production." Management encouraged employees to suggest ideas to improve efficiency and increase production. And you'll notice, you actually can't see it, but on the bottom it says the TCOP Taxpayers Committee. This was formed early, shortly after the plant opened, and its goal was to keep workers on the job, to provide them with boost, encouragement to ask for their suggestions, because we were all spending taxpayers' money. More than 2,500 employee suggestions were implemented during the war, and after the war, Horne reported that their suggestions saved the government over $13 million. And one of the major strategies was the plant's recreation department. I found this very interesting. Lots of pages from the Twin Cities Ordnance News were devoted to this. And it was based on the fact that studies in the 1930s proved that recreational activities improved employee morale, increased work capacity, improved attendance, and resulted in better safety records. Horne hired a recreation director in early 1942, and employees were asked to complete a recreational interest questionnaire that proclaimed, quote, "A sane program of leisure hour activities will keep you mentally and physically fit to keep them shooting." The company built a recreation complex that included 4 softball fields, volleyball and horseshoe courts, and an archery range. There were intramural sports of all kinds: baseball, basketball, softball, volleyball, bowling, golf leagues. At one time, over 1,400 men and women participated in 21 bowling leagues, and 800 women were involved in the softball leagues. In June 1943, TCOP brought Patty Bird, pictured here on the right, in to give a golf clinic at the Armour Golf Course for any women employees who were interested in learning golf. There were several activity clubs, including trap shooting, horseback riding, fishing, dancing, and photography. There was a 150-piece chorus and a 58-piece band. And now, as I went through this, I kept looking for New Brighton stories, and here's another one. This is the story of Eleanor Hipp, pictured here. Eleanor Hipp grew up on the Hipp farm. If you're from New Brighton, everybody knows that we're the Hipp family. and that's where Long Lake Regional Park is now. I found out, I tried to see if I could track her down to see if she might still be alive. I found out she died last year at age 99. But I was able to find her daughter, talk to her daughter, and her daughter told me that she enjoyed her time at TCOP, and that being so close, she would walk to work, and she was especially enjoyed playing on the TCOP All-Star softball team. They took the best women from the softball teams and put them on an all-star team, and she played on the all-star team in 1943, 1944, and 1945. And in 1943, the Monarchs, pictured here, and this is in the Charles Horne papers at the Minnesota Historical Society. He had everybody autograph it. And, but this is the Monarchs, the championship team from 1943. And here's Eleanor Horne again, from a picture from the Twin Cities Ordnance News. Now, the employees and also the residents of New Brighton were called upon to make huge sacrifices during the war years. Rationing of essential items began in January 1942 with tire rationing. TCOP, almost from the beginning, launched a Share Your Car campaign, and in May 1942, and they aggressively promoted carpooling throughout the war. Gas rationing, which came in December 1942, further accelerated the emphasis to encourage carpooling. Twin Cities Ordnance News would have anywhere from a half page to a full page of ads asking for rides wanted or passengers wanted. And there were bulletin boards up in the plant. In 2 months, in July of 1942, the State Highway Patrol did a survey of the carpooling to the various war plants around the Twin Cities area. And they found that the #1 war plant was TCOP with 2.9 riders per car. Coffee was rationed from November 1942 to July 1943. There was a 1 cup a day campaign. Can you imagine just limiting yourself to 1 cup a day? And there were war bond drives, 6 of them while the TCOP plant was in operation, and participation was always high at the plant. Employment at the plant began to decline in late 1943, and by March 1944 it had stabilized near 10,000, and that's roughly where it stood for the rest of the war. In 1944, 2 of the principal manufacturing buildings were withdrawn from production and converted to making 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter shell cases. Not the actual completed armament, but the cases. And these contracts were given to National Can and International Harvester. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's surrender on August 15th. Several days later, TCOP was notified by the War Department that its contract would be terminated soon. The plant closed shortly thereafter. In October 1945, Horne proudly summarized TCOP's accomplishments in an address to the Hennepin County Bar Association. Well, thanks, Wayne. The plant produced 4.5 billion cartridges. A total of 37,000 people worked at the plant through the war years. And they shared a payroll totaling $112 million, an average of about $45 a week. Now, what was the plant's impact on New Brighton? In short, the village was forced to grow up quickly. The decision to build the plant near New Brighton brought both economic prosperity and significant challenges. In the late summer and fall of 1941, The village was flooded with government agents, contractors, construction workers, and job seekers. New businesses like the New Brighton Concrete Company, which supplied concrete for the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. And the Travel Coach Company. And the trailer home is a product which is very necessary to the war efforts of, and every community should do what they can to make it pleasant for trailer owners. Although they were headquartered in Minneapolis, they had a branch in New Brighton. The Sunday, September 28, 1941, Minneapolis Tribune declared, "Munition plant blooms New Brighton." The reporter wrote, "Placid New Brighton is stirring from its Rip Van Winkle slumber. It is becoming a boom town." The population more than doubled in a little over 2 months. Merchants were enjoying a strong upswing in business. 83-year-old Franklin Searles, Wayne's great-grandfather, and he was the owner of the lumber yard in town, and he is quoted as saying, "This is bigger than anything that has ever hit our town. My business has increased greatly. I can hardly handle it." Mayor Albona predicted a population of 3,000 within the year. The village hired additional law enforcement officers. And it also had to hire more bartenders for the municipal liquor store. The liquor store had been established in 1939, and it proved to be a great moneymaker for the village. Here it says, in the article, if you can't see it, it says, "Alcoholic well ripe for tapping." The net income of the liquor store quadrupled in the first year, in 1941. Now, housing presented one of the most pressing issues. People constructed housing from whatever materials could be obtained, and trailer camps sprang up in and outside of the village boundaries. In January 1942, the Minneapolis Times estimated that nearly 2,000 people were living in trailers. In a 1994 interview, Ted Seth, who moved to New Brighton from Cannon Falls to work at the teacup plant, and he moved in January, he recalled that they were able to find a little shed, quote, little shed, in the village, and he was able to convert it into a good little house. On March 3rd, 1942, the village council approved 3 ordinances to address housing issues. The first first ordinance was a community zoning ordinance that established, quote, "definite zones for residential, commercial, industrial, and farms," unquote. The second one created a building code governing the construction of new buildings, required building permits for construction, and provided for the hiring of a building inspector. And the third ordinance was known as the Trailer Camp Ordinance, and it required license and established regulations for operating a trailer camp within the city boundaries. The new school also was impacted. It had just been built 2 years before. It was overcrowded. By early 1942, enrollment had increased by 70 students. The library and playroom were converted into classrooms. New Brighton was one of 22 school districts around the nation in 1942 in communities where war plants were being constructed to receive a special grant from the U.S. government. New Brighton received $4,510 to hire 3 new teachers, to purchase desks and textbooks. Now, road congestion was, many people I think said that road congestion was the biggest issue that the community faced. In a 1994 interview, Carl Holmberg, who was an ambulance driver at TCOP, was asked, how did New Brighton change with the coming of the ordnance plant? He laughed. Well, it finally got run off the map with the amount of traffic that went through. He laughed again. All day, the traffic congestion was humongous. I mean, it just defies description. The highways weren't meant to handle all this traffic, unquote. In 1942, the state added 2 additional lanes to highways 8 and 10 near the plant. Bus companies established special bus service from both downtowns. I wish I had a photo. I saw a photo too late, but of a line of buses all picking up people to bring them out to the ordnance plant for the shift change, and from surrounding communities. Minnesota's first automated traffic signals, those which were able to sense how much traffic was coming and so that they could help the traffic flow, were installed at key intersections in the area. And in 1945, Highway 100, which is now 694, was built between Robbinsdale and New Brighton. In concluding, I'd like to cite the census figures from 1950. New Brighton's population of 2,218 represented a 237% increase over 1940. Mounds View Township's population more than tripled from 1,924 in 1940 to 6,182 in 1950. The stage was set for the rapid suburbanization of New Brighton and northern Ramsey County in the 1950s and 1960s. And the Arsenal was there still providing jobs during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And this is a view of New Brighton in, I think it's 1955, and just that year or the year before, Mounds View High School was built. And I think it's up in here. Nope. And that's a look at the Arsenal during World War II. I would like to, in addition, thanking these people here for the images. I'd like to recognize a few people who were really important for me in doing this talk. Wayne Searles. Wayne, where are you? Wayne helped with a lot of the research, and Wayne did, he was sort of directing the marketing effort that brought you all here. I'd like to recognize William Horne. I met him years ago when I was working on the Greatest Generation project at the Historical Society, and when I said, I'll take this project on, I'll do it, I was hoping that Bill might still be living, and I found him, and he is out in Wayzata. And like I say, he had hoped that he could be here, but Bill gave me some materials and also shared with me a number of stories. Dr. David Fredrickson, you see here, he has a collection of federal cartridge materials and record information, and spending a day with him was really special. I'd also like to recognize Bart Ward. Bart, stand up. Bart from Anoka, the Anoka County Historical Society, very helpful in the research on Federal Cartridge Corporation. And lastly, I'd like to recognize my wife, Catherine, who, if people know me, they know I am technology illiterate, and Catherine is my expert on putting together the PowerPoint. And it's 3 o'clock. Wow. I do want to say there was a sign-up sheet outside that if your family lived on the land, or if you have information that would be of help to us as we continue to explore this, I'd like to ask you to please give us your name and number and just a phrase about what kind of information you have. And if there are questions, I'd be happy. Wayne, I know, wants to share something that came in from that a person sent to the New Brighton Area Historical Society who couldn't be here.
we really come up in class. You know, we had a little marketing ploy here. You know, when there's free admission, we were going to charge you for leaving. But, you know, I say a lot of people really were generous in donating to us, and we really appreciate it. Really. We are just a bunch of beggars. We're nothing but a volunteer society. Nobody gets paid anything. And we're happy that you all came. We're very pleased with it. I got a letter from a lady, email, but it's you're telling about her mother who's 99 years old, and she worked at the Arsenal. And I said, well, we'd sure like to interview her. And she said, well, she's got dementia and she can't do it. But she said, I'll read this. I do remember her telling us the story of her supervisor watching her pack the bullets with gunpowder. Mom's bullets always seemed to shoot further, and they wanted to know why. She said she would add a little extra powder in the casing and give an extra tap to tamp it all in. She would always have a twinkle and a cute smile every time she told that story, as well as her finger motioning a tap, tap, tap. My grandma lived in Anoka and worked at the Federal Cartridge plant in Anoka. Driving by the Arsenal on Highway 96 on Saturday or Sunday nights, traveling from Grandma's to White Bear, where I grew up, we were always fascinated by these red streaks that would shoot by on the other side of the fence. Mom explained to us that those were sample bullets with tracers in them. I'm thinking there must have been hills filled with bullets. Your program would have helped me fill the gaps of Mom's story as well as Grandma's. Keeping my fingers crossed that the cable people will show up. And they did. Thank you. Oh, and if Joe and Smiley would get a hold of me afterwards, I appreciate it. A little secret there. Hey, so Sophie Skiba, 104, is still living, and she worked at the Arsenal. Okay.
Mark Haidet, you did it. Excellent presentation. It shows what a professional historian can do, and it really went well. So we appreciate your effort. Thank you all for your support, and I believe the program is going to be over, but if you have any questions.